Welcome to What's Law Got to Do With It, presented by PwC, the podcast where we look to the past and present of our guests and what they think about your future. My name is Victoria O'Toole, and today with my colleague Yana Ford, we are joined by Joshua Rosenberg KC. Joshua is a qualified solicitor, legal affairs commentator, and widely published journalist.
Joshua, thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
So I guess the very first question we have to ask is, as someone that has chosen a career in legal journalism over perhaps the more traditional routes of law, what inspired you towards legal journalism?
Difficult question to answer, really. I mean, the practical point was that somebody told me that the BBC was running a training scheme for journalists, and my wife was training as a journalist at the time. And this friend of ours said to my wife, "Why don't you apply to the BBC scheme?" And she said she was very happy in newspapers. And so I think it was my wife rather than the friend who said, "Well, why don't you try?" And I was a trainee lawyer at the time, what we used to call a solicitor with article clerk. And the scheme that the BBC was offering sounded rather exciting. It was a training scheme, just as you would for a solicitor. It said candidates will be required to take a voice test, which sounded rather glamorous. And I applied on a whim. And to my great surprise, they offered me a position on the training course. And I then had to decide what to do. Do I stay training to be a solicitor with a fairly predictable outcome? Or do I throw in my lot with the BBC and see what would happen if I decided to move into journalism? And of course, if you're faced with a choice like that, then my advice to myself then and to anyone else who's listening would be to take it. Because if you don't, you generally regret it. You think, what would have happened if I had done this? So the only way to find out is to do it. And I did it, and I stayed with the BBC for 25 years.
Okay, I suppose, is there any point during that you looked back and you're like, Christ, I wish I was a solicitor because I could be at the front of that? Or did you prefer the reporting aspect of it?
I did prefer it. I never looked back. Looking back now, I think I might have had more fun if I had been a barrister and then given that up and become a journalist. But I didn't really think I was up to that. I think I could probably have managed to be a barrister on reflection. But the barristers I knew were doing pretty high-powered stuff. The people I knew at university, I knew I wasn't in their league. But I could probably have managed in some areas of the law as a barrister, I suspect, particularly the criminal law.
And just to pivot slightly, when looking at legal journalism, do you think that it has a responsibility to inspire the next generation of lawyers? And if so, is the way that we communicate with that next generation changing?
A lot of lawyers say they were inspired by reading great novels. To Catch a Mockingbird is the one that people remember, or by seeing lawyers on television these days and in films. I don't think they were inspired by legal journalism, but I don't suppose people really notice legal journalism. They read the newspapers, they read reports of cases, they might read what legal commentators like I write. And occasionally they say, "I like your job." And I say, well, there are not many jobs for legal journalists. Become a lawyer and then you might move into writing and then see where that takes you. But I never encourage anybody to go into legal journalism. And legal journalism is a specialized aspect of journalism. You need to start as a journalist and then you move on to specialize.
I wonder then, do you think it's different? You mentioned in your book, Enemies of the People, particularly with the Millie case, that when legal the law really comes into conversation is when it is at that intersection of politics and media, when that sort of gains most tension. Do you think with a generation that is becoming increasingly politically active and particularly media savvy, do we think that the law will be more centered to conversation? Will we see an increase in the likes of legal journalism in the future?
I don't see any sign of it in this country. It's more prominent in the United States, where litigation is more of a spectator sport and where the courts probably play a bigger role. I know that you both work in Northern Ireland, and there's a great deal of law in Northern Ireland. The courts in Northern Ireland have fascinating challenges to deal with. And I do quite a lot for BBC Radio Ulster. And they always pose the most interesting legal problems and expect me to understand them and explain them, and commentate on them. And, I'm desperately rushing to catch up and find out what's going on. I think there is interest in the law, but I don't know that it's ever going to be as centre stage as it would be if we in the United Kingdom lived in a country where the Supreme Court made law in the sense that the US Supreme Court makes law. The US Supreme Court can declare law unconstitutional. Think of abortion, where that was effectively what they did recently, or perhaps more accurately, they said that a previous attempt to declare something unconstitutional was wrong. And the courts in this country don't have quite the same role, but they're still pretty important. Down the road as we're speaking, the Court of Appeal is spending 4 days considering whether illegal migrants can be deported to Rwanda. Well, that's of great importance to the government. The government is in court all the time. So there are some very important cases.
Do you think that leans possibly into a fear of law becoming too politicised, and then increasingly political actors will then become judges, or they will take on, or barristers, for example, would take on cases that only sort of align with their political interests and possibly not even the common good of the law?
I think that's something we have to be concerned about, yes. I don't see any real sign that it's happening. I do see quite recently there was argument that people shouldn't prosecute people charged with causing criminal damage as part of a protest against the environmental laws. The various people who are protesting Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion, whatever it may be, but who feel they have the right to cause disruption. And they have a right to cause some disruption. But there are also criminal laws, and if they break those, then they may find themselves prosecuted and convicted. And I don't like the idea that somebody should say that it's a matter of principle that somebody shouldn't act for the prosecution. In cases where you have a public prosecution service, like the Crown Prosecution Service in England and Wales, like the Public Prosecution Service in Northern Ireland, which decides that a prosecution is in the public interest. I don't think it should be independent for individual barristers to say, no, I don't think it is in the public interest and I'm not going to take part. But to answer your broader question, are the judges being politicised? I don't think so. I don't think you could really assess the political views of any judges, certainly not in England or Wales. You might be able to point to the past president of the most recent past president of the UK Supreme Court, Lady Hale, and say that perhaps she's a little less conservative with a small c than Lord Reid, the present president. And I think he would admit as much. But beyond that general approach, I don't think you could say what political party any particular judge would vote for. And it's very clear that lawyers who take an active part in politics and public affairs are not the people who become judges.
Great. I guess as well, we would like to ask, you've mentioned a few of the hot topic issues at the minute, the likes of Just Stop Oil or with crisis immigration. What would you say to those just starting out their careers in law? What topics should they be aware of at the minute to be on the pulse of the legal conversation?
Well, I've always been interested in the interface between law and politics. I've always been interested in judicial review, which is the way you challenge the decisions of a public authority, local government, national government, or some public body. Because I think these are the cases which the courts find most challenging and therefore the most interesting. The general approach has been that the courts don't try to take the decision again themselves. They don't say whether they approve of the decision. They just check the way in which the decision was taken. So they look at whether the decision maker took into account things that the decision maker should take into account, and perhaps whether the decision maker failed to take into account other things. They look at whether the balance between conflicting interests was proportional. And they've developed these rules to ensure fairness and so that decisions are taken better. And if they don't like the decision, they generally say to the decision maker, we're going to overturn that and you must decide again. So they try not to get too involved. But I do think that seeing where they draw the line is a very interesting question, and it's not particularly predictable, and therefore, it's fascinating to see.
So if you were to predict the future of what law would look like in maybe 10, 20, 30 years, what do you think it looks like for a young lawyer?
It's obviously going to be more automated. We've seen that for the past decade or two, I suppose, in terms of document analysis and so on. Discovery of documents in cases used to involve people I use sitting in a locked room with piles of files looking through documents for particular things that are going to be of importance to your client. And this was a laborious process. I never had to do that sort of thing when I was training to be a lawyer, but it's well understood that that's what used to be done. And now it can be done electronically. And we are going to see a greater move towards this. The Master of the Rolls, Sir Geoffrey Voss, the most senior civil judge in England and Wales, gave a lecture last in which he asked himself whether judges were going to be replaced by robots, by artificial intelligence. And he said, well, not really, but nevertheless, there may be certain aspects of the work that may be automated in the not too distant future. And I think that is an important aspect of it. In a way, that's good because it means the routine work can be given to machines. But obviously, you need to check machines. I mean,
when it comes to you've been reporting for 30 years plus now, and when it comes to topics that you find gain a particular reaction from this next generation of lawyers, are there any topics that you see that gain a particular response, or maybe that are surprising you in the response that they get?
I wrote a piece about the post office scandal a couple of days ago. This is a case which is very well known. This was sub-postmasters who were wrongly convicted after private prosecutions by the post office. It's a scandal because the post office must have known that the evidence on which these people were convicted was flawed. And these cases went ahead and people were sent to prison wrongly. They were fined wrongly. They were made bankrupt wrongly. Some of them were driven to kill themselves. It's the most appalling tragedy. And 2 years after 39 of them were cleared, compensation is still being argued about. And it's not really been settled for many people at all, with the hundreds affected by it. And it's not a story I've covered in detail because there's another journalist who covers it closely and there hasn't been a great deal to say. But it did strike a chord with some of my readers, I'm sure, because it's a human tragedy. I mean, the BBC's covered it in some detail, and the newspapers have, and so on. But like everything else, it sort of fades into the background, and other things take priority. So I think, one is aware in terms of journalism that the human interest stories and stories that affect real people are the ones that get most traction. But in terms of legal journalism, I come back to the issues of public law. As I say, the challenges over Rwanda are particularly interesting. The challenges between the last Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, and the European Court of Human Rights, and Raab's attempt to introduce a Bill of Rights bill in the House of Commons. I mean, it was published, but it never got as far as a second reading. All these challenges. If you mentioned earlier in a question that there is concern about, you mentioned earlier in a question that some lawyers are being criticized for the work they do, and some of that criticism comes from the politicians. Mm-hmm. And that's not a good thing. Fat cat lawyers is the cliche. It's a very bad thing to associate a lawyer with that lawyer's client. It's a very bad thing to accuse a lawyer of acting improperly when the client is simply being represented by the lawyer to the best of the lawyer's abilities. And I think that that sort of approach by people who should know better can damage public confidence in the legal system.
I totally agree. One specific individual that I think really does a fantastic job of sort of dispelling myths around the law is the secret barrister. What he does in terms of actually looking at, for example, a sensationalist headline in the Sun or the Daily Mail, and she's saying, well, this happened, but here's a whole lot of backstory that you're not being told about, and look at why you're not being told that. I think it's an incredibly, incredibly important thing, because I think law has this big, massive shroud over it. And I think we're sort of shrouded in this level of mystery. And I suppose for the layperson to try and understand that, it can be quite difficult. And I think making law as accessible as possible is something that I think should be absolutely imperative.
I do suppose that it feeds into the likes of, with your book, Privacy in the Press. Do we have, is there a conflict there between protecting our journalists and protecting our lawyers? And when it comes to can we be fully transparent with either?
Well, there are issues of privacy, as you say, and there are aspects of journalism which will evade privacy. I'm aware of a particular case of somebody who would be in the news if it were not for the fact that this person has asked not to be in the news. And I've respected that, even though it would be of some interest to people if I were to write about this. He's not done anything remotely discreditable. On the contrary, he has been the victim of an unfortunate incident. But for various reasons, he doesn't particularly want this to be known or not known at the moment. Although I know about it, and lots of lawyers know about it, none of them has breached his privacy by writing anything about this publicly or by speaking to the newspapers about it. And that's fine. You might think that journalists are under duty to, put everything into the public domain they possibly can. And some journalists do. And you could say that specialist journalists who have contacts and who need to keep their contacts, do better by respecting confidences, and not reporting things until they're in the public domain. Sometimes, you don't do that. I speculated on who was going to be the next Chief Justice of England and Wales, in a piece 2 or 3 months ago. And I'm sure that the candidates would have preferred their names not to be made public. But on the other hand, if you are going in for the top job in those circumstances, that's the price you pay. What it means is that the successful candidate will be named, and then the unsuccessful candidate will be known to have tried and come second best, which is unfortunate for that individual. But, if you are aspiring to a public position, that's just one of the consequences. And with a very, very small field, I think only 2 candidates were interviewed. It's inevitable that people are going to know who the successful one was and who the second one who didn't get a job was. And they will know that one person is regarded as being better than the other. But that's the way it works in life.
Okay. So I suppose the general question is, what advice would you give to your 19-year-old self?
To my 19-year-old self. Well, my 19-year-old self was studying law at university, but nobody had really told me how to study law. There was then, and I think it's still in print, a very good book by a man called Glanville Williams called Learning the Law. And that tells you something about the basics of it. It tells you how law reports used to work in the days when they were printed. It tells you how cases are described. It tells you about the terminology and so on. But what it didn't tell me was to read loads of cases. I thought the law was to be found in legal textbooks. Obviously, the legal textbooks included extracts from cases to build up the summary of the law, which a textbook, particular student textbook, must contain. But no, we did read cases, obviously, in the law library, because that's what you had to do when they were all printed in those days, and nothing was online, of course. But nobody really said, read the cases as thoroughly as you can. Nobody said to me, look at the arguments and work out what you would have done if you were the judge. I wrote a book called Enemies of the People 2 or 3 years ago, which was aimed partly at students, certainly at 19-year-olds and slightly younger people and slightly older people. In that book, I tried to tease the reader by saying to the reader, here are the facts, what would you do? So if you read cases with that sort of inquiring mind, then you may well find that you begin to understand the principles of law. And even if you get it wrong, you've at least thought about it. So I think my 19-year-old self would have been better advised to have studied cases, read around the subject, thought about it, and not merely tried to memorize the textbooks.
I know that's very important. I remember when I was and I'd said this to you before, I wanted to be like this human rights academic when I first entered law school, because I thought that was the best way to help people. And then I remember I had read one specific tort case and it was a footnote. And then suddenly it just sparked this whole interest in corporate governance in me. And I don't think I would have been where I am today if I had not read that specific case. So I think that's very important.
No, it is. It is. You can probably remember which case it was and what the principle it established was. But I won't ask you because you're asking the questions. But you're absolutely right. I mean, for example, when I was at university, my tutor was junior counsel in a case of great interest. It was a case about somebody who owned a cottage in the countryside near Oxford and rented it out to students, and they used it for smoking cannabis, and she was prosecuted, she the owner of the property. And this was argued out, I think, before the Law Lords, the highest court in the United Kingdom. And my tutor was junior counsel and went along, didn't say anything. But if he'd said to me, look, I'm going off to this case, why don't you come and sit in the back of the court? I'd been fascinated, absolutely fascinated. But it didn't occur to him that I would be interested. And it didn't occur to me that that's what he was doing. It didn't occur to me that I could do that. And before the Supreme Court was established, it was quite difficult to know how to find the House of Lords as a judicial body and whether you could go in. It's a public court. Of course you could, but you needed to find the committee room where it sat. So you needed somebody to show you the way. But that sort of thing would have been absolutely fascinating. I might not have followed it all, but he could certainly have talked me through it while we were waiting for something to happen. But it didn't occur to him, and it certainly didn't occur to me. Spend time in court if you possibly can. We're sitting here near Charing Cross Station in central London, and I used to work for a law firm just across the road from here. I was thinking about it on the way here. It was 55 years ago. I just think it was a terribly old time ago. And I used to go down the Strand to the law courts, which are short bus ride away, 10 minutes walk, and appear before junior judicial officers called masters, and argue that we should have permission to file the document late or something like that. And it didn't occur to me to go and sit in a court and listen to Lord Denny or somebody famous like that judging cases, even though it was the same building. I regret that. It was a shame.
When it comes to reporting on such a range of different topics, and there'll be people listening that are maybe studying a range of different legal topics or at the start of their careers when they're doing bits and pieces that maybe aren't exactly what they're looking to do in the future. How do you find that interest in you report on everything, and we've seen the likes of your blogs, such a range of topics. How do you find interest in each individual legal topic?
Well, some are more interesting than others, there's no doubt about it. But it's usually blind terror. You have to write something on something, or do a broadcast on something, perhaps at very short notice. And you desperately try and understand it in order to put something over that makes sense. There's a personal aspect to it. I don't write about areas of law that I find really dull. And I don't write about areas of law that I know absolutely nothing about and can't find anything useful about. But like most things, as soon as you delve into them, you begin to find them more interesting. And the general approach I take is that if a broadcaster rings me up and says, we want you to talk in an hour or half an hour or 20 minutes or 5 minutes from now on a subject that you know very little about, then, the natural reaction is to say, no, I can't do it. But you find from experience that, generally speaking, you can make a pretty good show of it. And certainly nobody else could have done it. And if that's what they want, and if they're prepared to pay for it, then you do it. And you realize that we were just being a bit sort of cowardly saying you couldn't do it, and that it's really quite straightforward. So you have certain incentives to do things. You mentioned my blog. I started my blog nearly 3 years ago now, and with all blogs, as has subscribers, you're trying to increase the number of subscribers out of interest. And the way it works is that for the full service, subscribers have to pay. But those who don't pay, and there are many more of them, get an adequate service, by which I mean they get some blogs, but not all of them. The incentive to get more readers is one that's there. Altruistically, it's because one wants to spread the word more broadly, but slightly more selfishly, it's because one wants to increase one's reach as a blogger.
This is the blog for our listeners. This blog, A Lawyer Writes, which we would highly recommend as anyone starting out if you want to, again, stay on the heart of legal topics.
That's right. The address is Rosenberg, spelled ROZENBERG Rosenberg.substack, substack.com. But if you search for Rosenberg and Substack, you should find it.
You should.
So free placement.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I got to.
But it makes life more interesting, more exciting.
Perfect. I think that wraps everything up.
So just thank you so much for joining us today. And we really appreciate this discussion. And best of luck with your continued reports and your blog. And we look forward to keeping up with everything you have to say.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you to invite me. Pleasure to be here. It's very interesting. And good luck with your legal careers, the two of you. Thank you.
Thank you.